The war didn't begin in the jungles around Khe Sanh. It began years earlier, when Vietnam split in two and the world's superpowers chose their sides. What started as a civil conflict turned into a Cold War battleground where every village and every hillside became proof of whose vision for the future would survive. The North fought with discipline, patience, and the belief that time itself was their greatest weapon. The South fought with American firepower behind it. Bombers, helicopters, artillery, and the promise that overwhelming force could bend a war's direction. But firepower couldn't erase the jungle. It couldn't erase the tunnels, the hidden supply lines, or the fighters who moved like shadows through the trees. Year by year, the conflict dragged deeper into the mountains, where territory meant nothing and endurance meant everything. By 1968, both sides were searching for a moment that could break the stalemate. That moment came when the North Vietnamese Army chose a remote marine outpost on a ridge near Laos, a place called Khe Sanh. Not because it was valuable, but because its destruction could change the entire narrative of the war. If they crushed the Marines there, the world would see the limits of American power, and if the Marines held, it would cost them more than anyone watching understood. This is how the war reached its breaking point. A divided nation, a drawn-out struggle, and a lonely base in the mountains about to face the storm meant to decide everything. They were already surrounded when the first shells fell. No warning, no distant echo of artillery warming up, just an eruption of force that tore through the fog and told the Marines at Khe Sanh one truth. The North Vietnamese Army had finally closed the trap. In that moment, the outpost stopped being a remote base in the mountains. It became a hinge point. If Khe Sanh collapsed, the northwest frontier of South Vietnam cracked open, and the NVA would surge through it like water through split stone. Everyone inside the wire understood instantly that their survival wasn't just personal. It carried the weight of momentum for the entire war. The first barrage cratered the airstrip so violently that the ground buckled under boots. The NVA had hidden heavy artillery in caves carved deep into the Laosian mountains, far enough away to avoid counter-battery fire, but close enough to strike with terrifying precision. They had spent months preparing this moment, digging tunnels, stockpiling ammunition, and positioning infantry in the dense jungle that surrounded the base on all sides. The Marines couldn't see the enemy, but they could feel them. Every shell was a reminder that the NVA were controlling the battlefield without showing their faces. The airstrip was their lifeline, the only way supplies and reinforcements could reach them. By sunrise, it was a minefield of shattered asphalt and blackened dirt. No trucks could cross it. No aircraft could land safely, and the men were left with a question no soldier wants to face. If the enemy has already taken your escape route, what exactly are you defending? But they didn't break. They dug deeper. The early hours were a blur of collapsed bunkers and choking dust. Medics crawled through rubble to reach the wounded. Communications Marines spliced wires while shells landed around them. Because if the radios went dark, the air support above them might as well not exist. Snipers took positions knowing they'd be targeted first. Machine gunners reinforced sectors they couldn't even see through the smoke. It wasn't strategy yet. It was survival. By nightfall, the atmosphere changed. The artillery tapered off, replaced by something quieter and far more unnerving. Movement in the brush, wire cutters clicking softly, the soft patter of hands testing fences. Flares shot into the sky, revealing nothing but shadows slipping back into the trees. The Marines realized the NVA wasn't rushing the base. They were studying it, mapping weaknesses, counting bunkers, preparing for a siege that would squeeze the life out of the defenders inch by inch. Inside the command bunker, no solution looked clean. Concentrate men to secure the airstrip, and the perimeter thins. Spread them out to hold the perimeter, and the airstrip stays dead. No supplies, no reinforcements, no chance. Either choice led to disaster. But there was no time to debate. The NVA were tightening the noose with every hour. The Marines chose the impossible option: defend everything. The next weeks turned the base into a ritual of controlled misery. Artillery erupted daily, sometimes hundreds of shells in a single hour. Mortars rolled across the base at night, hitting bunkers, trenches, the medical area, even the latrines. Snipers watched for any head that rose above the trench line. The men learned to move, hunched, sprinting from crater to crater like hunted animals. Resupply became madness. C-130s made low, fast passes, throwing pallets from their rear ramps without landing. Some planes flew low enough that Marines could see the pilots' faces. Half the supplies drifted into enemy territory when chutes malfunctioned or winds shifted. But if even a single crate made it to friendly hands, it meant another day of ammunition, another day of water, another day of life. Marines risked their own limbs to drag supplies back through shell fire, because without those boxes, the base wouldn't last another week. Food ran thin, water was rationed. The wounded piled up faster than they could be evacuated. Men slept in their boots, ready to sprint if a bunker collapsed. No one wanted to die buried alive, but plenty came close. February arrived with a new horror. The NVA trenches began creeping toward the wire. Every morning, Marines inspected the terrain and found fresh lines, zigzags of dark, freshly turned earth. The enemy wasn't just surrounding them, they were tunneling their way inside. If those trenches reached the perimeter, the NVA could launch an assault from just yards away, overwhelming the wire in minutes with sheer numbers. Marines braced for the final storm. They cleaned their rifles, checked trip flares, stacked sandbags, and memorized fallback positions. Some even wrote final letters home and sealed them in plastic, in case someone found their bodies later. No one said it out loud, but the fear was shared. When the NVA attacked, it would be like a dam breaking. Then, unexpectedly, the pressure changed. Movement at night slowed. The trenches stopped advancing. Attack probes became hesitant, probing only lightly before withdrawing. Scouts reported fewer NVA silhouettes moving in the hills. At first, it felt like a trick. No one trusted it. But intelligence officers pieced together the truth. The B-52 strikes pounding the jungle were doing catastrophic damage to NVA preparations. Shock waves were collapsing tunnel networks and obliterating supply caches. Entire staging areas were taken out before the NVA could assemble for a full strike. Air power, not manpower, had created the first crack in the siege. It wasn't victory, it wasn't even hope. But it was the first moment the Marines felt the enemy was bleeding too. Still, the NVA refused to withdraw. They stayed hidden, coiled tight, waiting for their moment. That moment came in the early morning darkness, cold, fog thick as wool, silence shattered by mortars slamming into the perimeter. Heavy machine guns opened next, sweeping the trench lines with tracers. Sappers crawled through the wire with satchel charges, tossing explosives into bunkers. Some positions vanished in clouds of dirt and fire. Men clawed their way out of rubble with ringing ears and bleeding faces. Smoke made vision useless. Communication broke down. Marines fired at shapes, shadows, anything that moved. Some fought hand-to-hand in trench corners where rifles couldn't be raised. Others were pushed back by sheer force and had to counterattack with grenades, dragging wounded comrades behind them. One breach near the southern perimeter held for nearly an hour. A handful of Marines, most already wounded, refused to fall back. They fired until their barrels glowed red and the air filled with the stink of overheated metal. Their commander chose to reinforce them instead of pulling them to safer ground. A decision that risked dozens of lives but kept the line from collapsing completely. Was it brilliance or desperation? Would you have made the same call? By mid-morning, the NVA assault broke apart, not because they lacked courage, but because the defenders refused to give them the room they needed to break through. The NVA pulled back into the brush, dragging their wounded, leaving the dead tangled in the wire. The Marines didn't cheer. They didn't smile. They didn't believe anything was over. They just waited for the next wave that never came. Weeks later, the siege dissolved as quietly as it began. Reinforcements arrived. The fog lifted. The jungle fell silent. When the Marines walked the ground outside the wire, they saw how close death had come. NVA trenches lay, just yards from the perimeter. Some were only a few steps from the bunkers. If the NVA had advanced even a single night faster, the outcome might have been entirely different. The base was a ruin. The airstrip looked like a cratered wasteland. Medical bunkers overflowed with the wounded, who had survived only by inches. The living moved slowly, hollow from exhaustion, shock, and the weight of what they'd endured. Strategically, Khe Sanh proved a brutal truth. Air power could halt even the most disciplined infantry assault, but holding a position didn't mean controlling a war. The NVA learned that sheer numbers alone couldn't crush the Marines in a static siege. The Marines learned that endurance had a breaking point, and they had been inches from reaching it. They held the base, the flag still flew, but the war beyond those mountains kept moving, demanding more sacrifices, more battles, more years of uncertainty. Khe Sanh became a legend. But legends rarely speak about the men who walked away hollow. War doesn't pause for funerals, it mutates. Rumors filtered into the base before official reports ever did. Strange movements across the country. Communications intercepts growing more erratic. Whispers of coordinated attacks in places that had been quiet for months. Officers dismissed half of it as noise. Enemy propaganda, false flags, misread intel. No one wanted to believe a new disaster was forming so soon after Khe Sanh. But the enemy had waited for this moment. While the world stared at the siege, watching B-52 strikes hammer the jungle, the NVA and Viet Cong had been weaving a far more ambitious plan. Khe Sanh wasn't meant to be the killing blow. It was meant to be the distraction, a spectacle, a baited hook that lured American eyes to the wrong battlefield. The Marines at the outpost didn't know it yet, but they had been fighting inside a decoy, one so convincing that even Washington believed its fall would mirror the fall of the entire country. That illusion broke on the last night of January. Across South Vietnam, the familiar rhythm of the war shattered in a single coordinated explosion of violence. Cities that had echoed with market chatter erupted in gunfire. Remote hamlets near the Cambodian border lit up in tracer fire. At nearly every major town, military installation, embassy, and base, Viet Cong and NVA forces launched simultaneous assaults. The Tet Offensive had begun, and for many Marines, the first sign they had of it was the sudden congestion of radio traffic. 1,000 voices crackling in panic across the frequencies. At Khe Sanh, the men listened to reports coming in from Da Nang, Saigon, Hue, Pleiku, each one sounding worse than the last. Entire enemy battalions had materialized inside city centers. Police stations fell within minutes. Convoys burned on the roads. Even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, supposedly among the most secure sites in the country, was stormed by a team of Viet Cong sappers who fought room by room. The shock was absolute. The idea that the U.S. and ARVN armies controlled the cities collapsed in a single night. Inside the bunker at Khe Sanh, officers stared at maps littered with enemy attack markers, realizing the siege they had suffered was only one piece of a mosaic designed to overwhelm the entire nation. The NVA hadn't needed to take Khe Sanh. They only needed America to believe they might. That fear had tied down thousands of troops and hundreds of aircraft, all of which were now too far away to affect the cities under assault. For the Marines on the ground, the revelation hit harder than any artillery strike. They had fought for weeks believing they were defending a key strategic point, unaware it was a stage built to divert attention from the real theater. And yet, That didn't cheapen their suffering. If anything, it made the sacrifice feel sharper, edged with betrayal by the logic of war itself. Their blood had been spent to mask the enemy's true intentions. But the Tet Offensive didn't unfold as the NVA expected. Their gamble was bold, but boldness isn't the same as accuracy. Many city uprisings lacked local support. ARVN units fought harder than anticipated. American forces, stunned but not broken, counterattacked with ferocity. The offensive spread the Viet Cong thin, exposing them to devastating losses. In some cities, entire Viet Cong units were wiped out to the last fighter, their bodies left in courtyards and alleyways as grim testimony to the cost of miscalculation. Still, tactically failing is not the same as strategically failing. The enemy understood that too. The Tet Offensive broke something inside America that no battlefield victory could repair. Footage of fighting inside cities, places the public had been told were secure, cracked the illusion of progress. Reporters filmed Marines dragging wounded civilians from burning buildings, rooftop gun battles, fields of bodies in Saigon. The country that had believed the war was winding down suddenly saw that it wasn't even close. Back at Khe Sanh, wounded Marines sat on cots, listening to the radio as commentators back home spoke of stalemate, deception, and wasted lives. Some men clenched their fists, others stared at the floor. They had endured one of the hardest sieges of the war, only to learn that the enemy had outmaneuvered the narrative, if not the battlefield. Days turned into weeks as the Tet Offensive slowly burned itself out. The Marines at Khe Sanh were ordered to hold their position, even though the strategic value had now become questionable. The NVA had shifted focus elsewhere, but the base remained surrounded by craters, trenches, and the ghosts of men who had died defending it. Patrols ventured out, only to find abandoned tunnels, discarded equipment, and shallow graves. The jungle seemed to absorb everything without remorse. Then came the order that made many Marines question the nature of sacrifice itself. Months after holding Khe Sanh at immense cost, Washington decided to abandon it. Engineers planted charges, destroying bunkers, fuel dumps, the command center, and finally, the runway. The base the enemy had failed to take by force was now being handed back to the jungle by American choice. For the men who had fought there, the decision hit like a gut punch. They had endured terror, hunger, bombardment, and exhaustion to keep that hilltop from falling. Now they watched plumes of smoke rise from the structures they had bled to protect. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't surrender. It was something murkier. Strategy overriding sacrifice. Some Marines said nothing, others cursed under their breath. A few laughed, not out of humor but resignation. In war, even victories can rot when exposed to time. As helicopters lifted them away from the smoldering ruins, the men could see the full shape of the battlefield below. Trenches winding like scars, shell craters overlapping like scales, shattered trees pointing skyward like broken spears. The place looked ancient already, as if the jungle had been waiting for centuries to reclaim it. In the end, the siege of Khe Sanh achieved something neither side fully intended. It proved that firepower could hold ground. It proved that determination could break armies. But most of all, it proved that wars are not won solely by battles. They are won by the stories nations believe. Khe Sanh told two different stories at once. To the Marines, it was a testament to endurance, a reminder that courage doesn't always come with triumph. To the North Vietnamese, it was evidence that America could be manipulated, distracted, and stretched thin. To the world watching on television, it was a symbol of a war that no longer seemed conquerable. The siege ended, the Tet Offensive ended, but neither victory nor loss could wash away what the war had become. History remembers the strategy. It forgets the men who paid its price, one shell, one breath, one night at a time.